Well, I want to welcome you. I want to acknowledge the awe-inspiring environment that we're sharing this evening. The religious overtones might make you think you were in one of the two-party conventions, but I hope in a few minutes to make you clearly aware that other than the environment, not that much that I share with either of them. So let me begin by promising you two things. First, to provide to you a different way of understanding what's happening to the economic system and our position in it than perhaps you have heard before. And even more important than what this book is about, an alternative solution for dealing with it, different from what you might have heard before. So first, where are we here in the United States and in the world economy? And I'm not going to tell you what you already know, which is that this is the worst economic crisis in my lifetime and therefore in yours. That it began in 2007, which means it is now coming to the end of its fifth year, and that there is no end in sight. That the efforts of governments around the world, including the United States, to end it long ago have not proved successful, that the prognosis is not good, that the problem is almost like a disease in the sense that it begins in the United States in 2007, 8, and 9. The Europeans look at the United States and thank their lucky stars that it isn't so bad, only to discover that it is metastasized over there. And the last 2 or 3 years, it's a terrible problem in Europe, and Americans are thanking their lucky stars that it isn't quite so bad here. The Chinese are discovering that it is spreading to them. The Russians and the Indians have already discovered it, and the United States is now beginning to recognize that our own chances of coming out of it are being undercut by the realities in Russia, China, and so on. It keeps going because they haven't found a solution. Most of the effort to explain it involves games of blame. Right now, we're all aware that the Republicans blame the Democrats and vice versa in an endless chorus that begins to sound the same after the 14th speech by whoever's looking for a job promotion in whichever party. And then the blame goes beyond that. People on the left like to blame bankers, people on the right like to blame poor people who take out loans, so forth and so on. I want to break from all of that. I want us to acknowledge that in this economic system that we have, which has a name, it's called capitalism, there are a set of rules, and that most people, because they really can't avoid it, play by those rules. Bankers make loans in order to make money. Corporations do what they do in order to make money because that's what the people who make decisions in corporations are hired to do. And working people try to have a job that's decent and try to earn an income. And if they can't do what they think they ought to do as good citizens, as good parents, with the jobs and incomes they have, well, then they borrow money. And that works out real well because the banks are real eager to lend it to them. And we have everybody performing pretty much the way they're supposed to. When a society has people who are all playing by the rules and can show you that that's what they're doing, and the end result is the kind of disaster we have, then it isn't any more appropriate to blame this or that actor. It's time to recognize that the system of rules is the problem. Everybody's playing by the rules. Everybody hopes that will all work out, but it doesn't. In my profession of economics, we have a great philosopher with which all economics courses begin. His name is Adam Smith, and he's famous for the following line: if everybody pursues his or her own self-interest, it'll work out for the best for everybody. Most of you know that that's silly. It's a wonderful rationale to go out there and do what you want for yourself and not care about anybody else, but where that leads is exactly where we are, in a very, very bad crisis. So let's begin by analyzing this crisis as the crisis of a system. And we'll go on and talk about the system even when it's not in crisis, because that's as big a problem as the crisis itself. But crisis is where we are. 2012 is the 5th year of this crisis. What does that mean? First and foremost, it means that we have, in the United States today, something on the order of 20 to 25 million people who either don't have a job at all, have been without a job long enough that they've given up looking, so-called discouraged workers, or folks who have to take a part-time job because that's all they can find, but they would like to have a full-time job. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington keeps records like this. And so it's roughly 20 to 25 million of our fellow citizens, something on the order of 15, 16% of our workforce. That's staggering. Alongside of these people, there's another statistic. This one comes from the Federal Reserve. It's a statistic called the capacity utilization rate. It measures what proportion of the tools, equipment, machines, office space is being used for production and what part is sitting idle. What part of our capacity is being utilized. And the Federal Reserve has now pointed out for some years it's roughly hovering around 20% is not being utilized. 20% of our tools, equipment, machines, vehicle fleets, you name it, sits idle. Okay, you don't need an advanced degree in economics. I have one, but you don't need it. To understand that if there are 20 to 25 million people who want to work and don't have a chance, and we have 20% of the tools, equipment, raw materials for those people to work with, that a system that cannot put these two together to produce a quantity of wealth that would solve most of our social problems quickly is a system that doesn't work very well. That's a fundamental problem of our economic system, that it produces a crisis of this sort. I won't take the time to tell you the details of what happens to people who are unemployed, particularly for long periods of time, and the current unemployment is very long for people who are without work. They suffer self-esteem problems, they suffer mental and physical health problems, their families are more likely to break up, they lose the skills that they once had when they're out of work for long periods of time, their children have more difficulty in school. The costs of these kinds of crises last for generations. The amount of human damage, the amount of waste of resources is beyond calculation. A system that does this, let alone a system that does it repeatedly, cannot talk about efficiency. Because whatever the efficiency is of a particular factory or a particular production process is completely overwhelmed by the inefficiency of massive numbers of unemployed people, unutilized resources, and lost output that could meet social needs. But it's worse. It's not just that we're in a crisis now of horrific proportions for 5 years. It's that this is the second major breakdown of this capitalist system in the last 75 years. The last one was the 1930s. Begins in 1929 and isn't really over until 1940-41. A terrible crisis. And between the end of that one in the 1930s and the beginning of this one in 2007, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the official agency that counts crises, counts 11 more downturns in which millions of Americans, and I'm not even talking about other countries, lost their jobs, capacity unutilized, output foregone, again and again. Crisis is not an occasional interruption. Crisis is part of how this system works. And it always has. As far back as the last 200 years of capitalism, it has a crisis every few years. And it's important to stress this because politicians tend to like, for obvious reasons, to characterize each crisis as if it were a special occurrence. So, for example, every president in the United States since Franklin Roosevelt has, during his tenure as president, had at least one economic downturn. Every one. And every president said at one point, here are the policies I am proposing, And they have two great qualities. Number one, they will get us out of this crisis. And number two, they will make sure we never have a crisis like this again. Every president promised it. No president has delivered on the promise yet. That tells you something. The system is crisis prone. And that is a very serious defect, to say the least. But I don't want to limit myself to crises. I want to also talk about the system when it's working well, when their unemployment is relatively low. What happens then? First, capitalism has a tendency everywhere to polarize income and wealth. It's a kind of driven system in which the competition, as you all know, of enterprises one with the other, is pretty cutthroat. And most of the time, the company that wins the competition literally eats the one that has been defeated, buys its equipment, hires away its workers, and so we get the ever larger winners. That's why most big industries have 2 or 3 left. They've consumed all the others. They become very big and powerful. These days they become so big and powerful, they're all household names. And when they begin to have trouble, they make us all pay for their problems by telling us they're too big to fail. That's how big they've come. So we polarize in a capitalist system. We produce poles of great wealth at one end and poles of real poverty at the other. Sometimes, when the system really breaks down, masses of people get so angry that they begin to push back. Very interesting. In America, that happened in the 1930s, when we had a terrible depression, when the unemployment rate, which today is about 8.5% officially, number of adults looking for work as a percentage of our labor force. If you look at the comparable number in the depths of the depression, it was 3 times that, 25%. So it was really very bad. And interestingly, in the 1930s, the American people pushed back. They were not passive, they were active. Let me tell you what they did, because it's a part of our history that Americans tend not to learn too well in school, for reasons I will leave to your speculation. We had the biggest labor movement organization that the country ever had. Something called the Congress of Industrial Organizations organized millions of workers in the 1930s, in the depths of the Depression. Workers who had never been in a union before. We've never seen that in the United States. We had never seen it before, and we've never seen it since. In the midst of that misery of the Depression, of that poverty, American workers decided that a labor union could maybe save them. And they were ready to join. And joining was often tough. Working against government, working against the corporation, working against the police. Alongside the unions, the CIO that did the organizing, were 2 other institutions that were important then, and that may surprise you. Socialist parties here in the United States and the Communist Party of the United States were powerful. They had a lot of people, and they worked together with the CIO. And together they went to the government at that time, and they said 2 things. We represent the mass of working people, and we don't want to suffer the way we're suffering in this breakdown of capitalism. You got to do something. And they addressed themselves to a kind of middle-of-the-road Democratic politician who had just gotten elected president on a program of a balanced budget, Franklin Roosevelt. And they said to him, you've got to do something for the people. And the socialists and communists said, you got to do something for the people, but they added a little barb, because we think that there's a better system, an alternative system to capitalism. And if you keep performing as badly as you're doing in the depths of the Depression, we're going to try to establish that alternative. And they pointed across the ocean to the Soviet Union and said, see, like them. That scared folks. And Mr. Roosevelt was a good politician, smart. He listened. And he responded because he knew politically that these 3 forces, CIO, socialists, and communists, had enormous support in the United States. They were very powerful. And that they could mount a serious problem for this country. So Roosevelt went to his friends. You know, he came from a very well-established, very wealthy family. And he went to his wealthy friends, many of whom were businessmen. And he said, look, I think I got to do something here, because if I don't, we're going to have a lot of trouble. And, dear gentlemen, you who are very wealthy and you who run the big corporations, not only do I think we need to do this, but you're going to have to pay for it. The government has no money. We're in the depths of depression. Nobody's paying any taxes. Nobody has jobs. So you're going to have to pay. The rich and the corporations. And here's what you're going to pay for. I'm going to take care of the people. I'm going to help poor people, unemployed people, an American population that's in trouble. I'm going to help them big time. And you're going to pay for it. And you know why? Because if you don't, coming down the road are those socialists and communists, and they're going to cut you a lot less attractive deal. And you know, something interesting happened. The business community and the rich were split. Half of them did not buy that argument. They were not convinced by Mr. Roosevelt. But half of them were. And Roosevelt was a good politician. With half of the businesses in his pocket, he knew he could count on the CIO, the socialists, and the communists to kind of work something out. And here was the deal. I'm going to get the money from the corporations and the rich. I'm going to help you on a scale you've never seen before. And in return, you're going to stop talking about getting rid of capitalism. You're going to mute that part of your message. You're going to celebrate me as the guy who gives the mass of people something they never got before. So what did Roosevelt do? 3 interesting things that I'll mention. 1, he created the Social Security system. We never had that before. In the midst of a depression worse than today, when there's no money in the hands of the government, none is coming in, it's really hard, we can't do anything, the president goes on the radio and announces that every American over 65 years of age who's had a lifetime of work is now going to get money from the government for the rest of his or her life. Thank you very much. What? Where would all the money come from? But you know, I've already told you, from taxing the corporations and the rich. And no sooner did he do that than he announced another new program, unemployment compensation. We never had that before in the United States. In the midst of a depression, when tens of millions of people are out of work, the president announces, I want to tell you all that everybody who's out of work is now going to get a government check every week for a year or two to make this easier. And who's going to pay for that? The corporations and the rich. But now comes the third program. President Roosevelt says, if the private enterprise system of the United States cannot provide work to tens of millions of American citizens who want to work, well, then I'll do it. And between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled 12.5 million jobs. Well, you're hired by the federal government. And who paid for all of that? The corporations and the rich. Wow. I'm not describing the Soviet Union or some fantasy or some impossible dream. I'm just describing American history. And not so long ago either. Wow. Just to drive it home. What did Roosevelt, how did he actually do this? Well, he was very courageous and clever. In the midst of World War II, to make this point really strong, he proposed a novel income tax. Here's how it would work. Above a certain level, and the level in those years was $25,000 a year, the income tax rate that would have to be paid is, President's proposal, 100%. That's right. $25,000 a year would become a maximum income. You know how we have a minimum wage? This would be the maximum income, the other end. The Republicans predictably went crazy. And they fought and they yelled and they reached a compromise. And the compromise was that above the top, the highest rate, the richest Americans would henceforth have to pay 94%. The law signed by the president. If you were rich in the 1940s, every dollar over the top limit, the highest bracket that you earned, you got to keep 6 cents. And the other 94 cents went to the president and to the government. And by the way, in the 1950s and 60s, it continued. 91% was the top bracket. Republicans endorsed it, Democrats endorsed it, Republican and Democratic presidents maintained it. And by the way, why? The answer was easy, and everybody understood it. It went like this. We have just come through the greatest depression of our economic life, the 1930s, followed by the most severe war threat we've ever had, World War II. The country has to pull together to overcome and rebuild from these two great sequential crises, and from each must be taken their capacity to contribute. And so we're taking from the rich their capacity. Here's some statistics for you. Beside the income tax on individuals, in 1945, I did a little calculation. For every dollar that the federal government got in income taxes on individuals, it got from corporations $1.50. Corporations as a whole paid taxes on their profits 50% more than individuals as a whole. What's the relationship today? For every dollar that is taken from individuals, corporations today contribute 25 cents. And what's the highest tax bracket? Is it the 91% of the 50s and 60s? No, it's 35%.